This episode of Pod Ever After contains sensitive subject matter and strong language. Listener discretion is advised.
Hey, Alana?
Yeah?
Can you tell me a story?
I can try. Once upon a time, there were two girls, nay, women,
Hell yeah.
who wanted to rewatch their favorite trash fairy tale program. They started with season 1, when everyone wore full makeup and they had no rights to Peter Pan. Spooky. Hello everyone. Welcome back to Pod Ever After, a bi-weekly Once Upon a Time podcast where we rewatch Once Upon a Time from the first season. I'm Alana.
I'm Tessa.
And today we're going to be talking about Season 1, Episode 3, Snow Falls, and Episode 4, The Price of Gold. Tessa, how are you doing today?
I'm doing great. It's late at night. The fireflies are buzzing outside the window. How are you, Alana?
I'm doing okay. It is late at night, and I'm kind of tired, so I hope that this conversation is as interesting as the last episode, which I'm glad that some people listened and that you enjoyed it. I hope more people listen to this one.
I'm sure they will.
I hope so. So the title of this episode is Episode 2, Everyone is a Pumpkin, which we will talk about later because everyone on the show is a pumpkin. Well, most of them.
Also, Alana is a pumpkin.
Also, I am a pumpkin, and Tessa is a pumpkin. We are all
Yay.
cute pumpkins. So why don't we get into it, shall we? Tessa, do you want to tell us what Snow Falls was about?
Sure. So the episode opens with a scene that we're all familiar with. Charming is riding in his little carriage, and suddenly they stop because there's a tree. And then that's how Snowing has her little meet cute, and it's not exactly love at first sight, but they're getting there. And then they go on this grand adventure and save each other, and she tries on the ring, and David realizes that there is no other woman he'd rather see it on. And then in Storybrooke, Mary Margaret is reading to John Doe, who is, spoiler alert, actually David, and later he wakes up because she smooches him. Regina shoves Catherine into the story because where has she been this whole time, even when he was a coma for the past 28 years? But we'll get into that. So, Alana, what was the first thing that you noticed about this episode?
Well, the first thing that I want to talk about is David, of course, because he said the word aspersions in this episode.
Which means... Okay, the word aspersions is a word that I was not familiar with. I know a lot of words, but that was not one of them. It means an attack on the reputation or integrity of someone or something. Continue.
I should have wrote his dialogue down because I can't remember the context in which that word appears.
But it's pretty fancy.
In reference to her. It's like in reference to her when she's hanging in the net. I don't know, but I was really impressed with his use of the word aspersions. And then also the fact that Snow seems to be the one in the net who doesn't believe in true love, and she's kind of trashing it, and he's just like, you don't believe in true love? Like, you know, he was a little boy, and if he was living in the modern world, he would have like a Pinterest board for his wedding and stuff.
Snow White would be the one
that I got.
She'd be the one pinning things like forests and woodsy paths, and he's the one pinning crafts about making centerpieces on a budget.
You know what I want to do now? I want to make some kind of mood board or something that are Pinterest boards for their characters.
Oh boy.
Like people do like their Instagram accounts or something. I've never seen someone do like a Pinterest account. It'd be really funny.
That's pretty exciting. Storing that idea. Anyway.
Went off on a little David tangent about Pinterest. But anyway, keeping in line with David, I had a thought while we were watching the episode that I kind of got the sense, like we had talked last time, that Killian and Graham might be really similar, and there was a question about whether or not Killian was just a replacement for Graham because Emma needed another foreign, handsome love interest. Um, and I had the thought this episode that I almost feel like David and Killian are far more similar than Killian and Graham. Um, and my reasons for that were they're both really cute. They're both pumpkins. Um, they're both very loyal characters. David is very sassy in this episode, and he's sassy in lots of episodes, actually. And I think that if David had lived a harder life, and for a longer amount of time, like, say, 300 years, I think they would have been fairly similar. Tessa, what do you think about that?
I think I agree because I think that they're also both very romantic people. They like to spoil their
Yeah.
women. Um, but like I'm also keeping tally of how Killian and Graham are similar to kind of match them up. And so far, David's winning. Graham only got a point this episode because he made puppy dog eyes at Emma, and they're beautiful. And Killian also makes puppy dog eyes at Emma, and they're also beautiful. But that's as far as those similarities go. So,
Killian's puppy dog eyes have more depth, I think. Like his. Because I feel like Killian has this really long history of
feelings.
really desiring intimacy and like falling in love with another person. Like he feels things very strongly, and Graham, the history we have of Graham is that he's kind of isolated and doesn't really like talking to people. And so I feel like when you have like Killian's desperation compared with Graham's, I feel like Killian's is more intense because that's something that it seems he needed to survive, whereas Graham got that same comfort like from hiking through the woods by himself. So I feel like there's an intensity to Killian's character that Graham does. Like Graham still has an intensity, but I just think it's different because of what they both needed to, be who they are.
Right, and I think
Um,
he kind of gives her the puppy dog eyes to be like, Emma, do this thing, and then but Killian gives her puppy dog eyes like when he's just like, love me, I want you to love
yeah.
me.
Yeah, and they're also like it's a combination too where he's sad for himself, but he's also sad for her. Like because I feel like he sees her denying herself friendship and love and all these things because she doesn't trust people, and so part of his sadness when he looks at her is also a sadness for her and not just about her. But we keep talking about Captain Swan, and he's not even in the show yet, so we need to chill. But
There is no
um,
chill.
yeah, we gotta chill about Captain Swan. It's not even happening yet. Um, moving on. Speaking of Emma,
Tell me how she
I
fits
re-
into my age group. How is Emma
yes,
Swan a bit like a
yes.
teenager?
So Emma Swan is a very teenager-like character, and I feel like other people have noticed this, but it's really noticeable in season one, especially because she's just getting into all of this. She hasn't really learned that much yet. She hasn't really grown that much. Um, but just all of her physical behavior. So she slouches. So the whole episode, the whole time, I could just hear my mom's voice like, "Stand up straight. What the fuck are you doing?" She slouches through most of the episode. She like rolls her eyes a lot. She talks back to people. She's constantly trying to prove herself to everyone, which obviously has a lot of contextual um, reasoning behind it. But I think it's a very defining character trait for her that we kind of see her as a teenage girl. Like she's an adult, but at the same time she was denied a lot of these things that we get when we grow up that helps us become adults and self-reliant. And I think you really see it in this episode.
Yeah, I think especially like when she's talking to like Regina or Gold, like this episode and the next one, um, they're kind of speaking very rudely to her, and instead of like, she's a little bit of an open book that you can tell that this is affecting her, but she's still very defiant on her face. Like she's like, bite me, and I feel like someone who spends most of her time at college, that is something I see a lot of people around my age doing. So,
Yeah. Yeah, there's obviously not an emotional maturity yet that we see from her much later on, and um, I think she does significantly improve. But I think you would agree with me on this that just because she does improve, that doesn't mean it goes away completely.
right. Uh,
Like the problems that she has that makes her act this way, especially with people in positions of authority. Um, it improves, but it's something that's going to affect her whole life. People should keep that in mind. That's all I'm saying.
Another thing I noticed about Emma in this episode was kind of a very subtle hint at Neil. I'm gonna be
Yeah.
upfront. I hate his guts.
So do I.
She talks to Mary Margaret about, well, she's talking to Henry, who wants to try to set Mary Margaret up, to wake David up. And
Yeah.
Emma tells him, well, you don't want to give her unrealistic hope. And she's very,
Yeah.
like, she tells him, and you can tell that she's just had that unrealistic hope before, and it's really broken her up when it was, when it turned out to be false. And for a second, I was like, well, where did she get that from? And then I was like, Neil Cassidy. I
Yeah.
just, I think that more and more as the season goes on, it's going to become self-evident about how much he really kind of affected her emotionally and mentally. And as the series goes on, we're going to see how much he really doesn't have to answer for it. Like, I could just
Yeah.
write about all the kind of, like, just what he did to her, all this sort of stuff that she suffers with as a result of it, and all the things that people expect out of Neil, or how the writers write him that doesn't line up with having to atone for it. So, that's my
Yeah.
2 cents.
I agree. No, I totally agree. I don't understand why certain characters get a free pass and some of them have to pay for it for 7 seasons and others don't. I don't understand.
We talked about that last time. And it's
Yeah.
like, Neil's not necessarily even a villain, but he still made crappy decisions that people are just like, oh, it's in the past. Don't worry about it. So,
Yeah. It's fresh. I mean, in a way it's realistic because in real life, sometimes the people that should face consequences for their actions don't, as is evident in our current political climate. But it's still frustrating from a narrative perspective, and especially with regards to consistency when you decide that you want some characters to have consequences for their actions and other characters don't. Especially when they do really terrible things. Like,
yeah.
come on.
Well, I think, like, a last note on that is that, in the end, the characters who did kind of get a more fleshed out redemption arc, like, it paid off. Like, they're the characters that people really relate with and can sympathize with, and then everyone else, all the other villains or characters that don't go through quite a journey as a character, you can tell that there's a disconnect between them and the audience.
Yeah, and it's definitely a critique I've read of Neil before where people were like, I could have enjoyed his character if he was a richer character. Like, there wasn't really enough of him for people to really feel any which way about him, except that, oh, he hurt Emma, so it's easiest to hate him. Which is how I feel about a lot of characters on the show, where I kind of don't feel one way or the other about them just because they didn't receive the same amount of backstory, I guess, or attention.
There's a lot of characters that I feel a certain way about because I read about them in fan fiction. I'll read a lot of, like, I read a lot of fics where Ruby's in them, and we don't see her as much in, like, she just kind of sporadically appears, and there's not even a whole lot of characterization on that front, but, like, in most fics, she's got a very defined, like, personality. And so when I
Yeah,
read
so they
that,
were,
I
yeah.
mostly like it. And I totally forget that a lot of that it just kind of came out of nowhere.
Yeah, I feel like when she's come on screen in the last few episodes, most of what I know about her is probably being pulled from fan fiction because they don't really pay any attention to her until they needed like a token gay character that they didn't pay any attention to until it was time to be gay for a second. So,
Oh boy.
but we'll get to that. Um, so moving on, Mary Margaret and Emma's relationship.
Very sweet.
What
Very
the hell?
wonderful.
What the hell happened there?
What did
Um,
happen?
yeah, so I think a lot of people feel this way that everyone really loved Emma and Mary Margaret's relationship in the first season before the curse is broken. They talk more with each other than they do at any other point in the show, even after they know that they are related to one another. Um, I don't know if this is just also A&E focusing on character instead of wild plot twists and stuff. Um, but I was curious, and Tessa, maybe you can answer these questions. I had a few questions about this. So, do we think that the kind of destruction of their relationship was intentional, or just kind of an unfortunate case of not having the time to explore it more? Does it add depth to the show that their relationship kind of crumbles once they know that they're mother and daughter? I don't know if you have any possible answers to those questions.
Well, I think that if like you were sitting at a con and Adam and Eddie were on the panel and you asked them, did you mean for the relationship between Emma and Mary Margaret to fall apart? They would say, "No, I don't we don't think it fell apart at all. We think it was exactly how it's supposed to be." And I think that part of the reason why it's so different is because when they were writing the first season, granted the writing was a lot better in the first season than it was in other seasons, but that's beside the point. They were writing the two of them as they would gals being pals, like just as young women would who are getting to know one another. Like they're not the audience knows that they're mother and daughter, but because the two of them don't know it, then they act differently towards each other. And then as soon as they realize their relation to one another, their writing changes. Like suddenly Snow feels like she's gotta be the matron, and Emma
Yeah.
is kind of like, can't we just be friends? And Mary Margaret's like, I want to be your mother, and I want to be your mother right now. And
Yeah,
then
I
so
agree with that. Yeah.
when Emma doesn't really, I mean, she needs her mom, and they do have really nice moments throughout the series. But then I think it gets to a point where another character kind of needs a motherly figure, and then that character gets more of Snow's motherly attention.
Yeah, I mean, I've always been of the opinion that I think Emma is very angry at her parents, and I think she is for most of the show, and so it makes total sense to me that they're not as close. It's a shame to me that there's no effort put in to maybe try and repair that relationship, but to me, like if my parents abandoned me and just showed back up, it would probably take me some time to trust them completely. Like you don't just get over abandonment issues like that. And Emma doesn't even know about the fact that they abandoned her multiple times. They made the decision more than once. Um,
Right.
and so I think it's a really interesting case of, and this is why we need to have an episode just totally devoted to motherhood, and we're going to talk about this a little more during when we talk about the next episode. But a part of me is kind of like, well, if she doesn't really need it, then it's not a huge deal. It's just kind of another moment of Once Upon a Time wasting its potential and not devoting the time to fixing it. And I think Tessa wants to mention a fanfic that explores this idea really well. If
Okay,
people want to read
here's my plug for the day. So,
it.
a lot of people read, okay, 6,093 hits on this fic. What Comes Next by Unfolded 73. That name should ring a bell because all of their fics are just phenomenal. Everyone will tell you. And this fic specifically goes into they lived happily ever after, and then what happened. And there's this one scene where Mary Margaret like is talking to Emma, and she's like, I know that you're going through a lot right now, but I'm your mother and I want to help you. And then Emma's like, do you? Do you really want to help me? Or do you want to, go help Regina? Because that's what you've been doing for the past several months when I needed you.
Yeah.
And when I read that the first time, I was like, hold the phone. I need a second. I need to fan myself off because holy shit. What? Oh my God. Emma. Get it, girl. You call her out. And I just...
very nice to have seen that.
But they would never, because Adam and Eddie probably don't even realize, or if they do realize that they're not going to talk about it, that the relationship is really screwed up. But I like that this fic in general deals really well with that situation and calls it right out like it is.
Yeah, so if people are in agreement with us, or they don't really understand it and they maybe want to understand more, you should read that fic. It's really helpful.
But if you completely disagree with us, then feel free to let us know. Tell us what you think, because we clearly have an opinion on this, and I would like to hear maybe another view on that. So, anyway.
Sure. So the last thing we'll talk about for this episode, of course, is Regina. And, full disclaimer, I'm going full on with how much I don't like Regina these next two episodes.
We have a list going. Reasons we don't like Regina.
It's so... Okay, so first thing that I noticed this time that I did not notice last time, I just wasn't paying attention, I guess. When Regina magically pulls Catherine into this, circle jerk of craziness at the end of this episode, and Emma asks her, where have you been this whole time? How did you not know he was here? This isn't a huge town, which is a very valid question. Catherine goes on this little spiel where she says they got into a fight. Well, they weren't doing well in their marriage, and she says, "It was my fault. I know that now," which sounds like such victim-blaming language, and you know that it was just, put into her head by Regina. And so I think it was kind of interesting that you have Regina taking on this kind of sexist role in this episode by inserting Catherine into the situation as the kind of typical woman who blames herself for all the problems in her marriage, and it's just very traditional and misogynistic and disappointing, and it makes the whole thing 10 times worse, because I know a lot of people talk about there's a consent issue with this curse because people don't have their memories and they're making very intimate decisions with one another, and so I feel like this is another instance in which, Catherine, I get people are annoyed by Catherine because she interrupts the snowing drama, but it's not her fault. She ends up being really, especially once we learn her backstory and stuff, we definitely start feeling some sympathy for her, but...
I don't remember the backstory, so when she first came on and was fanning herself and bitching about the heat, I was like, oh, girl, shut up.
Yeah, no, she was, in love with somebody else, and, he gets turned to gold or something.
That's right, because her, yep.
They have to go to Lake Nostos, and, David helps her get him back, and then they're, friends afterwards and stuff.
Yeah, because I remember that they... in season 4 or whatever, they're like, oh, look, there's Catherine, and she's just sitting there, and I'm like, hey, look at that.
Another character that just, fades into the background. But, so that was one thing Regina does that we don't like. The other thing that we obviously didn't like and that we noticed was that she physically grabs Henry by the arm and, yanks him towards her, which was...
And it's not just, I feel like parents, if you see parents doing that, on the street, you're like, oh, well, it's because they're just kind of... This was, Alana and I didn't mention it to each other until after the fact, but, when I first saw it, I was like, wow, yikes, that was a little rough. And then Alana said the same thing, and if you go back and watch it, she walks up to me and she, oof. It didn't look or feel good, and I think it wasn't supposed to.
Yeah, I don't think it's supposed to, but, I'm not sure how many people notice it or remember it, because I think her, manipulation of him emotionally is pretty memorable, but it's not... I think the physical grabbing of him doesn't happen that frequently. I'll have to pay more attention to it, but it was just something that I didn't really remember, because she does so many other horrible things, just...
like,
passed
she,
through my mind.
like, thinking back on the episode, when I was thinking of, like, what about Regina in this episode really set me off? Because I was a little grumpy afterwards, and one of the things was Emma asks Henry, well, does your mom know that you're here? And Henry says, no, she thinks I'm playing whack-a-mole or whatever. And if she does know, she doesn't want to know. And I'm like, what? Every time Regina catches Henry off somewhere with Emma, she's like, how could you do this? How could you run off? Emma, how could you put my son in danger? But she's either completely oblivious to the fact that her son is sneaking out of the house, and, like, you gotta be pretty freaking dumb to not realize that your 10-year-old kid is sneaking out of the house on a regular basis. Or she's purposefully ignorant of the fact that he's sneaking off and she's just letting it happen. And in Storybrooke, where crazy magical crap is happening all the time, that puts the kid in danger, and we see that in upcoming episodes.
Yeah, I mean, I think a big part of Regina's arc is her growing into an actual motherhood role, because initially she just kind of gets a child for herself. She doesn't adopt Henry because she wants to help a child that doesn't have a home. She adopts Henry because there's, like, a hole inside of her that she thinks a child is going to fill. And it's like, when you get a child, your ego is supposed to take a back seat. And
right.
I think it takes her a really long time to reach that. And I'm not even sure she fully does by the end of the show. It's definitely improved, but
if that's what she wanted, she should have just adopted a dog.
I know. Well, her thing is that, like, you know, she can't have children, so that's some kind of failing on her part. And that's actually a good segue into our break before we get to the next episode, because we'll talk about how the writers seem to treat femininity and motherhood on the show, at least in the early seasons. So we'll take a quick break, and we'll be right back. Yay! And we're back.
Yep. So, Alana, okay, I'm gonna take the reins on this one. We're back to talk about the next episode we watched. It's episode 4 of season 1, called The Price of Gold, which is a pun because it's mostly about Rumpelstiltskin. Alana, why don't you tell us a bit about what happened?
So in this episode, Cinderella is in it. Yay.
Why? I like Cinderella.
I'm totally ambivalent about her. Anyway, so Cinderella's in this episode. We get her backstory. She signs a contract and gives away her baby, and it comes back to bite her in the ass in Storybrooke because the contract still holds. And Emma decides to stay in Storybrooke and take the job at the sheriff's office. Oh, and we also find out that Regina and Graham have been hooking up, so the ickiness really gets going in this episode.
Even more reasons we don't like Regina.
Yes. Anyway, before we really get into it, I just want to reiterate that there is some sensitive material in this episode, especially for the episode for the podcast. I mean, we're going to be talking a little bit about abortion and pro-life and pro-choice rhetoric that appears in this episode, so if that is going to be hard for people to listen to, you can just turn it off now. We won't mind, but I just wanted to say again that we'll be talking about that a little bit. But before we get into that, what are some of the less intense things that happened in this episode?
So things that we noticed, like the Captain Swan shippers we are, when Emma first moves into Snow's apartment, she's got, like, a few boxes, and Snow's like, that's not a whole lot to have, and she's like, I don't really stay in many places for a long time, and I just was like, it's just like Killian Jones, who's got a sea chest with his few belongings. So they're wandering people, if you will, in that respect. Good for each other.
Yeah, they are.
Also,
Uh,
Alana, you mentioned Cinderella selling her baby to gold. Why the hell? Why the actual heck would Rumpelstiltskin need a baby so badly?
yeah, that made me, the only thing I could think of for that was we know that in season three, yeah, it's season three, right?
Yes.
No,
Yes.
it's is it?
Yeah,
Yeah, it
it's
is.
3B.
It's 3B. Zelina needs a baby to execute her time travel spell, and so I was curious. I mean, I doubt the writers or this. They're so bad at continuity, but I'm curious if that was for a similar spell, possibly that he needed the baby, but who the fuck knows? He could have just wanted to like use its innocence for something or some weird creepy bullshit. I don't know.
Ew.
Yeah, yeah, I know. So that was those were kind of the two lighter things that we noticed in this episode, but
There's not.
um,
Yeah.
so the big thing in this episode is that you have an 18-year-old. She's 19, right? She's your age.
She's my age.
19. She's 19 and she's pregnant, and
has been for the past 28 years. I'd just like to say.
Also that I asked the question while we were watching. I was like, has she been pregnant for 28 years?
Nope.
So yeah, so you have one young single mother who has a baby, and then you have Emma who was 18 and pregnant. And there's no discussion in this episode at all of abortion. It seems to be assumed that you will either there's no question that the baby will be alive, that you will allow the baby to live to full term. So my concern is that it's giving the illusion that it's talking about being
choice.
Choice, because it's very much like, well, it's your choice, you can do whatever you want, but as far as I can tell, I'm only seeing the one choice, which is, oh no, that baby is going to stay inside of you and it's going to become a full baby. And obviously, like, I am fully, like, if you want to keep your baby, if you want to give it away, if you want to keep it, like, I am all for whatever you decide. And I understand it's, quote unquote, a family show, whatever. But it's odd to me that it's not even hinted at or mentioned. And I mean, especially Emma being in a prison, like,
right.
I don't know if people know much about our prison system, but if a woman is pregnant in prison, a lot of the time they probably encourage them to get abortions because they don't give a shit about women in incarceration. So my question is there an abortion rhetoric going on in this episode or in this show? Is it being done intentionally? Do they just not care? Is it because it's mostly men writing this show? Does it seem like to me, it seems kind of negligent on their behalf to have two young women struggling with pregnancies without partners and then they don't bring it up. It just seems kind of odd and a little lazy to me. And I found it mildly concerning. And, like, to me, it's totally in character that Emma would want to keep her baby because, she lived her whole life alone and nothing was ever hers and she never had anyone. And, if she has a baby, like, that's something that's hers, that grew inside of her, that's hers, that's not going to leave her. And she has to give it up and it's really devastating. So it totally makes sense to me that Emma would want to keep her baby. But the fact that it's not even mentioned and it seems to be...
Yeah, I definitely...
It just feels problematic to me, I guess.
I think coming from someone who would rather avoid difficult subjects and really has to push myself to, like, look at tough situations and, stuff like that, I think it could be a number of things, like you said, that they're just being negligent, or it could just be that for the sake of the plots, they just needed to have these babies done Her baby's born, not done. They're not bred in an oven. But I well, I think also at the time that the show, like this season was airing especially, I felt like there was a greater divide, even maybe more so than now, or maybe I'm just seeing it differently now that I'm a bit older, but it was a much more divided kind of, people really split on the topic. So bringing it up in the show, I feel like might have distracted from what they were hoping to accomplish, which is still their kind of pro-life, have the baby tones, but like, and it's also early in the season, and like if they're talking about abortion on a show about fairy tales, even though it would be really realistic to talk about, people might be like, oh god, there's gonna be abortion, Snow White's gonna decide to kill her baby, and then you have all the Christians and the other people who don't like abortion. As a Christian, I could say I know a lot of people who don't like it, and I don't like it either.
Yeah, I mean,
but I also think
I'm not saying that like there didn't need to be a scene where they're in an abortion clinic or something. Just the fact that it's not even referenced, or like someone vaguely does like, well, there was another decision you could make, or something along that line. It doesn't seem evident to me that it's being taken seriously as a possibility, which I just found, which made me kind of uncomfortable, I guess, because I hate when people only tackle feminist issues when it's convenient or when it's not going to cause a problem. And it's like, oh, look, we had this really strong female protagonist, but they don't mention a woman's right to choose, which is a very significant feminist issue.
And I think they're trying to like kind of avoid, like they're making the tone of the episode is very, it seems very feminist, because like Emma's like, if you want to have that baby, you can have that baby, and if you are being controlled in your life, then you fight back and you say, this is who I am, or whatever this speech is. And you're like, wow, that's really empowering, I just want to go punch something. But then also you're like, but then you miss the fact that they're totally, avoiding a serious topic.
Yeah, and I think it's totally empowering. Like, if a young woman decides to keep her baby, that's amazing. That's super impressive.
Yes.
I would say that if you thought you could do it, you should do it. But I just don't think it should be discussed in such an uneven way. Or even, like, the suggestion that, you know what, maybe not keeping your baby is a good thing for you. Like, maybe the thought of not having to care for a child at 19, maybe that's right for you, and that's okay.
As a 19-year-old, just... like, thinking about having a baby right now where I am in my life freaks me out just thinking about it. Like, I'm very small. I don't want to have a baby. And just, I feel for Ashley. Especially when she's, like, talking about her crappy boyfriend.
Yeah.
Crappy college boys.
Yeah.
Nope.
And Emma, like, obviously, Emma makes the decision to give away the baby because she thinks that that's the way he'd have his best chance, but she's obviously devastated. Like, she would have preferred to keep Henry, but it's also a realistic scenario that women give away their babies, and like, I'm sure they're sad, but they're probably also relieved, and you don't really get that impression from the mothers in this show. It seems to be like an all or nothing game, and that kind of irritates me because I think choosing to be a mother is a very complicated,
it's a big responsibility,
important choice. Yeah, it's a huge responsibility, and there's a lot of nuance to it, and I just wish that it was treated with, the degree of complexity it needs to really be discussed. Like, I know that it's on ABC or whatever, but it's like they want it to be kind of harsh and gritty in fairy tales, but at the same time they don't want it to be too much, and so it's just kind of, it annoys me a little bit. Like, I'm over it. It's not a huge deal, but it was something that I thought was pretty significant in this episode. It made me feel a little uncomfortable, but...
Yep.
Yeah.
But if you got thoughts on that, let us know, because...
Yeah,
I like to hear your thoughts. I'm excited.
Yeah, especially on that topic, because, like, Yeah, it was something I never really considered before, and when we were watching it the other day, it was something that I like couldn't stop thinking about. So I'd love to hear people's um, perspectives on that. But there wasn't really much else that we had to talk about in this episode, so I guess we'll end it there. Um,
Okay.
but we want to thank you guys for listening, and we hope you'll tune in for the next two episodes, 105 and 106. And again, unprepared, do not have the titles in front of me. But I'm sure I'll make a post on Tumblr, which our Tumblr is podeverafter.tumblr.com, or you can email us at podeverafter@gmail.com. And Tessa, do you want to try taking us out again this week, but better?
Yep, I'm not going to screw it up this time. So, we'd like to thank you again for listening, and we hope that you live Pod Ever After.
Good job.
Thank you.
Bye.
Bye!